This week on the Spotlight Report, we are speaking with Julius Muschaweck. He has had over 25 years of experience in the illumination field broadly. He came into the field with a project on concentrating sunlight, which I'm sure he'll talk about, and he later helped to form a startup. After the startup, he went to work for Osram, an LED and lamp manufacturer, and after that, he worked for ARRI, which does in a role both doing imaging and illumination type of optics, which again he'll speak more about. And currently, Julius focuses on freelance work and education in the illumination field. So Julius, thanks very much for being here.
Thanks for inviting me. My pleasure.
So illumination is something we had brief correspondence in my email. I had the benefit of working with Dr. Koschel at the U of A, but it's a field that is extremely important, extremely deep, and also, at least in my experience, most optical engineers don't actually have a firm grasp on it. So I'm curious, how did you get into the field? What brought you to it?
What brought me to it was, so I'm a physicist. I studied physics in Munich, and I ended up doing my thesis for solar thermal collectors, which had not yet anything to do with optics. But a little later, I got into a project where we tried to make a solar thermal collector, which would deliver heat at like 50% efficiency and 350 degrees Fahrenheit. And you can't just do that with a black plate on the roof. So it should have no moving parts. So no checking like you have in Tucson or wherever. Just, just a flat plate type of thing. The idea was that with that kind of heat, you can quite efficiently do solar cooling. I won't get into the details of that, but the high temperature is the key to do that efficiently. So the business idea was to replace peak electricity in the hot parts of the country by heat, and the way to do that is to take tubular black absorbers, which would be in a vacuum tube, and even that's not enough for insulation because you have to form sort of like a trough-shaped reflector around that.
Mm-hmm.
So that would capture the sunlight and redirect it onto the tubes, and then you would have all the sunlight captured, but you would have fewer tubes and fewer losses because they would be spaced further apart. So when I got into that project, I thought, okay, so let's do this engineering type of thing properly, and it all sounded like a little bit of pocket calculator science and metal sheet bending.
Right.
Yeah, now it's 25 years later, and I'm still doing the same stuff because it's way deeper than it sounded. That got me into optics, to understand the connection between the efficient collection or transport of light for energy purposes, not for imaging purposes, for energy purposes, and illumination is basically the same thing, and the connection between that and thermodynamics, which is really deep when you get to it. Light is governed, at least all we do in this field is basically governed by Maxwell's equations. And Maxwell's equations, they don't know the difference between past and future. But light does. Light doesn't conspire to bounce off the walls and illuminate a light bulb. It's always the other way around. And that's deep, and it's still sort of an unsolved mystery why that is so. And that just caught me. And that brought me to illumination optics. So we did that, and we did some really cool projects, and we built a world record collector at the time. And then that brought me to Chicago, where Roland Winston, who is well known to many people in the field, he invited me to be there in Chicago for a year as a visiting scholar to do this collector work. And then I met an old friend and colleague, Harold Rees, again from the University of Munich, who was also a guest lecturer in Chicago at the time, and over many steaks and many bottles of red wine in Chicago, we felt that solar energy was not suffering from a lack of research. It was suffering from a low oil price and lack of economic opportunity and lack of the general public being ready for it. Mm-hmm. Things have changed quite a bit since, but it was 1998 at that time. And so Harold and I decided to just, turn the light path around, and instead of concentrating sunlight from far away onto a small object that would be hot, take it from where it's hot, and then send it far away. And and we created this startup. So like it should be, it was in Harold's guest room in his little apartment in Munich. This is where we started the company. And we had no business plan. We just wanted to do illumination optics, and we knew our physics, and we thought, customers would come, and they did. And we did some really pioneering work on freeform optics. And I hear that you also know a few things about that. So I'm sure that you're familiar with the work that we did like 20 years ago. Yeah. And so we did that for a while. And then, I was in the field, and then one thing came to another. And I later then, I left that company because we did consulting at the time. And I wanted to get closer to being actual product. And that basically then started the rest of my career.
And what was, before we move on to your later career, what was the actual product that startup was selling?
We were providing optical design for illumination as a service.
Okay, it was consulting
Yeah.
at its most part. Okay.
And we also sold light tools and Code 5.
Oh, okay.
In the German-speaking countries.
Mm-hmm.
But that was just like a complementary effort.
Sure.
Selling the software.
I noticed in your, we'll speak about it, but in your Etendu and source selection video, the light tools has the German language, which for a second when you pulled up the menus, I said, "Oh, I'm not familiar with this." So,
yeah.
I'm really curious. At the time, in the 90s or late 90s, was illumination design in high demand?
No, it was an exotic thing to do.
Okay.
It really was. All the colleagues which I know from that time, and that's some poet has called it the small tender circle of people, because we used to have non-imaging optics workshops, and we would see the same like 20 or 30 faces at some SPIE conferences, and that was it. It was all people that were doing non-imaging optics for solar energy, basically, and illumination just wouldn't be done. And all of us have basically written their own ray trace code. At the time, when we did that, we were using our own ray trace code, and ASAP was available, but Light Tools was just in its infancy, and other programs weren't around yet. So basically, the software wasn't there, and
right.
And also the act. So the process, the notion of doing optical design for illumination as a service, that was sort of unique. There was, I believe, at that time in Germany, there was only one other small company who would do that. People would just do it within the companies and do some engineering by themselves. And remember, that was the time when automotive headlamps were like an incandescent bulb and a parabolic mirror, and then some glass with lenslets. So they would basically take the beam and use lenslets and little prisms to just send it around and to shape the beam like that. And you don't need software to do that.
Right. A very kind of intuitive feeling approach.
Yeah. And so at that time, it was really pioneering work, and that's also what made it great. And we started that in 1998, and I have to confess that only like a couple of years later, I became aware that there was an LED revolution bound to happen.
That was going to be my next question, is that, at the time, when you think about the number of illumination sources that we, casually consider, LEDs hadn't fully really hit the market yet, correct?
Way off. They were just expensive and weak and inefficient. That was the time where LEDs would double their efficiency every year. And that's not the case anymore.
Is that, did you see like a very drastic change once that started happening? Once you had LEDs? Yeah. Okay.
It was. So two things came together to make my profession sort of normal. And one thing was the advent of computers which were really powerful enough to do Monte Carlo ray tracing. Because although it seems to be simpler, you know, for an imaging optics, for the analysis of that, you trace maybe 100 rays, and then you know what the image quality is. For a decent, and for an automotive headlamp where you want to study like the details of the color of the projection lens on a projection system, you easily need 1 billion rays.
Right.
You trace that to the system, so you need a good computer. That was that. And the other thing was LEDs, where all of a sudden the photons were so precious that you basically had to caress them and then treat them and invite them individually to your target. And
right.
Those two things basically came together, where the expensive LEDs made the engineering worthwhile, which was made possible by the advent of the first computers and the advent of then commercial software like Lighttools, ASAP, and Fred, and Trace Pro, and Photopia, and more.
Right. So a number of things kind of coalesced at the right time.
And I just happened to be there just a little early.
Yeah. Convenient for you.
Yeah, convenient for me. Well, it's just how it happened.
Sure, of course. So after your work at your startup, you know, before I took that detour, you went over to Osram. And can you tell me a little bit more about that?
So Osram is maybe not so well known, but it's actually one of the largest lamp manufacturers. So incandescent bulbs basically was GE and Philips, General Electric and Philips and Osram, the three big names. Same for fluorescent tubes and also high intensity discharge lamps. And Osram to this day is also one of the largest LED manufacturers. And when I left my former consulting startup company, I actually had no plan B. I just took a break for a few months and then said, you know, people know me, they're going to find me. And that's what happened. Osram found me. We did some consulting work for Osram before that. And basically I wrote a letter to all my business contacts that I'm looking for new challenges, and that's how it happened. So they knew me already, and then they invited me to join the team. And then I joined Osram, the LED branch in Regensburg, which was great. And to this day, I consider that like one of the best things and the best experiences in my professional life. It was just such a wonderful team. And it was, you know, it was good from the very top, because the CEO in Regensburg of the LED branch, he sort of shielded us from all sorts of other things that came from the big Osram mother, and and you know, it's a kind of thing where you stand in the kitchen and you chat with a colleague and you drink a coffee, and then the boss comes by. And if the boss has any time to spare, he just joins and picks a cup of coffee and continues to chat with you, because everybody knows that everybody is just giving his or her very best to achieve the common goals, and nobody would be, you know, frowned upon just for drinking a cup of coffee. It was just, it was a wonderful experience. And for the first few years, the pioneering work that I did there was to bring LEDs to LCD backlights, which now sounds totally obvious. At the time it wasn't. At the time it was cold cathode fluorescent lamps, and then Sony was the key customer at the time, and we developed the science and engineering and logistics of bringing the correct LEDs to the right place to make LCD backlights with LEDs really work. Now there's nothing else, but at the time it was
the standard now. So
it totally is since over 10 years, but I've been part of the team that really made that happen, which was great. It was a great experience. I've been in Japan, I don't know how many times, and I had a very good relationship with the chief engineer of Sony, who was responsible for the project on their part. So I was sort of the head of the science for that part of the business at Osram.
And that inherently must be, or I mean, perhaps I'm wrong, but it sounds like that would be more of a research and development endeavor at the outset, correct? If it hadn't been done before.
It sort of was, but you know, you tend to split this process into different terms. So if it's research, it's more than 5 years away. If it's between 2 and 5 years into a product, it's called pre-development. And if it's like up to 2 years away, it's product development. And that was somewhere between pre-development and product development. And for those of the people who listen, who are active in the consumer electronics business, they know about the extremely fast cycles there. So there's a lot of time pressure to get things done. So we really did develop some new stuff to make that happen, but it was basically clear that technologically it's possible. We just had to make it work and figure out how that worked. And the team I was working in at Osram that was wonderful. It was, they called it application engineering, and their idea was that LEDs are little nasty bastards. You get down to it, because assume I am a manufacturer of screws, okay, and you are a furniture manufacturer, and you tell me, okay, so give me these screws. Yeah, I want a 1.5 inch screw with that and that diameter and a Phillips head. Okay, so I crank up my machine and I just make those screws for you, no problem. Huh? When I make LEDs, then the LEDs pop out of the machines in a way that they might be somewhere between 1 and 2 millimeters long, and somewhere between 3 and 5 millimeters thick, and some has a Phillips head and some has a, so they have quantities which vary widely, because it's just to this day impossible to control the manufacturing process any better. And that's not for lack of trying. It's just, the light is generated in like 4 or 5 atom layers of the semiconductor material, and the wavelength and the efficiency is determined by the precise, material composition of those atom layers. So how do you control that? Huh?
Right.
And you do this in epitaxy at 1100 centigrades. Okay, so, and it makes a difference if it's 1105, but you can't directly measure it. So okay, it's difficult. So so we started to binning, huh? and that's just what it makes all difficult.
Huh. And it's interesting because, I mean, you say that this is certainly still a problem. From what I've heard, you have generally kind of low yield on LEDs, but you can make a ton. So it's okay. Yeah. You just throw away the ones that don't work, so to speak. But, from a human visual perspective, I never notice it, or anyone else that I speak to never says, oh, this LED doesn't seem quite right. Is it what's the balance between kind of the tolerance that you can get on LED manufacturing and the sensitivity of human perception?
That is an art by itself, huh? And so let's just look at the typical white LED. A typical white LED, you just buy one, and then it comes from a certain bin, because they're all individually measured and then sorted in little bins, with brighter ones, darker ones, the yellowish ones, the greenish ones, the high voltage ones, the low voltage ones, and so on. So those are the properties. And then you buy LEDs on a roll or a box, and they all have the same bin. So they're close in their properties to each other. But it's difficult to get exactly the bin that you want, because, you have to either really pay for it if you buy single bins from a distributor. But if you do a project like LCD TVs, then you can't afford to throw them all away. You have to somehow make it happen. That's what the industry has learned. It has learned to sort of mix and match. You would take, if you have many LEDs in one product, you would take brighter ones, a brighter and a darker bin, and you would take a yellowish bin and a bluish bin, and a high voltage bin and a low voltage bin, and mix it together, such that the average is much more narrow than the total production distribution. And that's a logistical nightmare. Huh?
Yeah, absolutely. I can't even begin to imagine.
Yeah. I mean, I've been there. Huh? We made that happen for Sony at the time, huh? and developed that logistics process, which was just as difficult as all the other science, really.
Right.
And the industry has learned that, and now you also you want to achieve a certain brightness, and so what you do is you calculate the lowest efficiency bin or bin combination that you're going to get, and you design your drivers such that works. and then you can go from there. And if you happen to get brighter ones, then you just you adjust your current a little so it's lower. Or so this is really something the industry has learned to do. And they also, especially for white LEDs, they have really vastly improved the process of the phosphor deposition, which means that they can control very well now the relative amount of blue and yellow light to get the right mixture. So there have been great progress steps in the process, but it's still when you get down to the details of it, it's amazing how complex this whole business is.
Mm-hmm. And it sounds, and not to remotely denigrate it, but it sounds to some extent like an art, right? There's some amount of teasing out the qualitative aspect of it.
Yeah. And what I find so fascinating about it is this application engineering team where I was working in, that the job was to understand the needs of the customer, to help the customer actually integrate these tricky little bastards into his end product, and to go back and translate that into better products. That was really bridging fundamental science research, pre-development to the customer needs. And this long bridge, this is what has been fascinating me all my professional life, and could go there. And it's particularly interesting because, as it turns out, with LEDs, you have to apply some sort of holistic engineering, in the sense that if you do optical design for Nikon, okay, you make a 50mm lens for a Nikon camera. Then you make a 50mm lens for well-defined, interfaces like the mount and the size of the sensor, and then you make a lens that you basically can put on every Sony camera or every Nikon camera, and then there you can basically engineer the lens. Okay, that's difficult enough, but with LEDs, it turns out that everything just depends so much on everything that you have to, as an optical designer, you have to understand the thermal panes and the mechanical panes and the electrical panes and the assembly panes and the repair panes and this kind of thing. And you have to find optical solutions that help the other guys in the team solve their problems. And this is one reason why I think this whole illumination optics business is so fascinating, because I don't just sit in my chamber and think about illumination optics and rays. I always think about solutions that help the complete product. And so it's very wide, and it's always, every new project that comes in is fascinating in its own right.
Well, and this nicely steps into to your transition to ARRI after Osram. My background is more in metrology, and specifically more so for pseudo imaging type of optics. And the situation that we encounter is we have to know, to lambda over 10, lambda over 25, precisely how the optic is shaped, and it will always be shaped that way. And as you're saying, you can mount it precisely, and we don't expect much variation. So it's a very precise engineering system. And even when you come to the design of it, there are analytical solutions, and you can get to a very precise answer. And it could be, not only could it be, I'm sure that it is in part due to my lack of experience in illumination, but that's not how I view the design process for illumination. So at ARRI, you worked on both illumination and imaging. Can you discuss that process a bit and kind of the nuance between the two? Or even if it's not nuance, the absolute distinction.
So actually, there was not too much overlap between those two fields in ARRI. So basically, it's just one of those things. I got hired by ARRI because my good friend Markus Zeiler, who was my first boss at Osram, became the head of the illumination branch at ARRI, and he is now the chief technical officer at ARRI. And he knew that I was not too happy at Osram anymore, because Osram just wasn't doing too well. Osram had really big trouble, and has trouble today, to manage the transition from traditional lighting to the LED business, which is much more than just technology. It's just it's a different way of business. It's electronics, and electronics is just much faster than making a plant that that uses tons of glass every day. And
right.
and so that's the difference. So I just joined ARRI, and basically when I joined, there was no job description.
Well, that's exciting.
They just wanted to have a guy who knows a lot of stuff about illumination to help the lighting branch, and they also knew that I know a few things about freeforms from my freelance part. We didn't get to that yet, but maybe we will. And they were interested in the use of freeforms for imaging, and they thought I would be the guy to help them figure out what's in it for them. So that's like the two things which I did for ARRI. Well, no, that's the two things which I did for most of my time at ARRI, I must say, to make the lamp heads better and to do pre-development and optical concepts for lamp heads at ARRI, which was great, because it gave me a chance to visit film sets, because again I had to understand the needs of the end customer, which is the chief lighter, the chief gaffer. And I've been over the place. I've been at film sets in Hollywood and in China and in Germany, and I've been talking to some big names in the business, and they, you know, when you come from ARRI, which is really the company, ARRI is making the cameras that have been used to make Oscar-winning movies for about 100 years now. So since the 1920s, ARRI is making cameras, and the ARRI Flex is the legend camera for film. And now the ARRI Alexa is again the leading camera for digitally shot movies. And I believe for the last 6 or 7 years, every movie that has been even nominated for like best movie or best director or best photography was shot with an ARRI camera, almost everyone. So when you come from ARRI, they treat you like a king when you come to the film set. It was amazing, and people are friendly and open, and they make time and they talk about. They're very open.
Right.
That was a fantastic experience, and so I understood a lot of that and helped to translate that into some better products at ARRI. And the other thing was they wanted to know whether we can make a freeform. We can integrate freeform optics into like camera lenses or a viewfinder and stuff like that. So there's also a recent paper from Aaron Bauer and Matthias Pesch and myself and a couple others about a freeform electronic viewfinder. You may have.
I saw that, and additionally there's one on an all reflective viewfinder as well. Are those the same papers?
That's the one. That's the one.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I'll be sure to link that as well in the postscript for this episode, so listeners can find it.
So that was a prototype for a 5 freeform mirror reflective viewfinder, which is actually quite compact, not much larger than another one. And electronic viewfinder, so for a display, for an OLED display or something like that. And people who have seen through many professional cameras and viewfinders say that this is pretty much the best quality they've ever seen. So,
and that's both for my own benefit and for the audience's benefit, who are not behind these cameras. Why bother? Why bother making an all reflective viewfinder, much less an all reflective 5 freeform viewfinder?
The goal is, so one step back, making a good viewfinder that gives you a large field of view at perfect optical quality is much, much harder than it sounds. It's much more than just a magnifying glass. And for the people who are in the trade, it's because the exit pupil of this viewfinder is basically the human eye, so it's outside the optics, which makes everything large and difficult and so on. And so you deal with all kinds of things. You deal with distortion, and one of the big problems is actually chromatic aberrations. And all reflective means no chromatic aberrations.
Right.
So
absolutely.
there you go. That was the idea to make that happen. But in the end, unfortunately, I don't think that's going to become a product, because in the end, the pros who look through these viewfinders, they can actually shoot great footage with a bad viewfinder as well, because they're so professional.
Right. They're so used to it already that they.
So maybe they make a product out of it, maybe not, but it was a great project. And just for the record, I didn't do the optical design. That was done by Aaron Bauer from the University of Rochester.
Oh, okay.
I was the project lead at ARI. And so I'm not an imaging optics designer, but I understand enough about imaging optics to sort of also respect what Aaron did there.
So I think that this, I have a remaining question, but I'll keep it for later on when it's maybe some less technical questions. But you know, this opens up the opportunity to discuss freeform optics, which you worked on, and then you also worked on in consulting. And you know, beforehand you had said it's worth asking what your opinion is on them. So what is your opinion on freeforms?
Freeform optics for illumination is probably overrated in terms of number of papers that are published and amount of research work that's been done about it. So let me put it like this: freeform optics, like for illumination, goes like that. Okay, you have a light source, like a small or extended light source, I don't care, and then just assume that you have like a round mirror, a round metal mirror, and then you reflect the light onto the wall, and then you get like a homogeneously illuminated ellipse. Okay, so that's easy to imagine. Okay,
right.
And then you take a little hammer and make a dent into the image, into the mirror. Okay, then the distribution changes a little bit. If you make a dent, then it's locally convex and it will create a brighter spot. If you don't overdo it, just, you know, gentle hammering. And then you change the distribution. You will have a bright spot where it's convex, surrounded by a darker ring, because there's concave and you have energy conservation and everything. The question is, can you, you know, take the hammer and create a mirror that creates an arbitrary desired distribution? That's what freeform optics is about. And there were pioneers in the field before us, like Vladimir Oliker and some others, who found ways to actually do that. But it was actually Harold and myself who really solved that problem to the extent that it was really usable software to create those freeform surfaces. So we did really pioneering work and also found that a solution to the differential equation that's behind that. But since then, I don't know, hundreds of papers have been written which basically do similar things like we did at the time. So it's still, the methods are restricted to point sources, and any extended sources which smear it out, they're extended like, they're treated like perturbations. And there's no really established method out there. There's some early research results, but nothing that's really usable in terms of like a rigorous way of treating extended sources. So there's a lack of, so the lack of progress really in big step, what's needed for the application is just not comparable with the amount of papers. So I have been reviewing a lot of them for the journals, and it's fantastic work. And they've also found some improvements here and improvements there, but it's not like a big giant leap.
Right.
When you look out there, there's still, I mean, where do you find freeform optics in illumination? So street lighting is a really big thing. So you put surfaces around the street light, but you never know whether that's been used by these tailoring methods or whether that's just optimized with some spline shape or what, or done by hand. And so maybe overrated as a topic, that's the wrong word, because freeform optics, they have a lot of promise, and it's in, so every car headlamp is with a reflector as a freeform optics, and every, so and many lamps and luminaires are freeform optics, if you like. So that's really everywhere. But in terms of the research activities and the attention it gets there, it's it's over researched and under applied, if you like.
And that's, and you know, from the imaging side of things, the not necessarily concern, but the perspective I have is that I've seen a number of kind of younger engineers or younger designers take the approach of saying, I have an optical system, it has aberrations, why don't I just add a freeform? Because it'll correct for it, without kind of having the appreciation of, there are some principles behind these aberrations that might be A, easier, better corrected, and B, not appreciating the
Yeah.
difficulty of making a freeform surface.
Yeah. So I'm not really an expert on that, but my take is, and I've been discussing this a lot with Kevin Thompson when he was still alive, and with people like John Rogers and Yannick Roland.
Mm-hmm.
And you may also be aware that Yannick Roland and Tom Zaleski, they are the two directors of what's called the Center of Freeform Optics.
Yep. I know Yannick.
Yeah,
I've met Yannick a few times. Yes.
Yeah. And so that's an activity like an industry, university, research corporation that's sort of managed by, or how do I say, managed by the National Science Foundation.
Mm-hmm.
So the industry gives money, universities do research, and right now there's really a large number of big names. So that's really a thriving endeavor, which I'm very happy, and I've been with that from the early days on. So I've been part of that incubator meeting,
Mm-hmm.
where that was basically baptized, and I was also, Ari was a member of that for some time, so that was great. And my take from that is that if you have a good rotational symmetric optics with lenses, and all you want to do is to make a good image, then freeform optics is not going to help you.
Right.
And people like Kevin and Yannick, they have some good theoretical reasons why there's not much to gain. It's a different story when you do reflective optics,
Mm-hmm.
because so the one of the really classics is the 3-mirror anastigmat.
Right.
And it turns out that that as long as you cut the tilted mirrors out of off-axis rotational shapes,
right.
then this lack of degrees of freedom limits your field of view for good correction. And if you move to freeform optics, then this is mitigated. And there is really sweetness in it.
Yeah.
So that's great. And this is also why so many people are interested in the Center for Freeform Optics, also from the consumer electronics industry, because everything that is like wearable AR, VR goggles, they probably need some sort of freeform to make it happen. No? And then so that's a fascinating field, but it's not exactly my field, because I don't do imaging for a living. I do illumination for a living.
Right. It's it has a lot of discussion there, certainly inside the imaging field. I'm kind of curious to hear as well your perspective. You have a physics background, and as well on your biography, it discusses your affection for math. And one thing I've observed kind of at the university level in optics is that optics can cover such a wide array of topics that you can have a superficial understanding and maybe learn a few equations or a few techniques without having a deeper fundamental reason for why you do things. I know that's a very ambiguous statement, but have you noticed this in optics, or do you have any thoughts on that general concern that I have in the field?
Or illumination optics in particular, or?
I mean, illumination optics in particular, but optics in general. Either one, whatever you care to speak on.
So that's really a wide field, because optics, that's a big topic. Huh? It's way more than lens design or illumination design. You have all this femtosecond and quantum optics stuff, and material science, and meta materials, and image reconstruction. So computational optics is a big topic, where you can basically reconstruct images where you can't see nothing with the naked eye because it's so scattered.
Right.
Like deeper layers of tissue on that. So that's all optics. And what you just said about learning a few equations and then understand a few things, that's true for quite a few parts of optics. And imaging optics is luckily a part of that, because to understand the basics of imaging optics, you have to understand the basic first order Gaussian optics, and then all the things, everything about like focal lengths and this kind of things, and then the primary aberrations are also not so hard to understand.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not too difficult for an engineer or physicist to get an idea what imaging optics is about. That doesn't make you an optical designer for imaging,
Mm-hmm.
because that's a long road to really be good at that. But I mean, I have never designed an imaging lens in my whole life. So I don't know how to do that. I have watched people doing that, and I'm amazed how good they are at that, but I can't. Still, I understand what they're doing, I understand their results, and I understand what kind of things they're trying to balance. So,
Mm-hmm.
and I can do that from my distance, and it was not too difficult for me to get to that level of understanding without really being a practitioner. I think it's different in computational optics, where
Mm-hmm.
things are just so complex mathematically. It's different in quantum optics because that's just so complex. Huh?
Right.
And illumination optics is then also a special thing because it looks so easy from a distance, but it isn't.
Mm-hmm. And so are there analogous kind of first principles in illumination optics as there are to imaging optics, for example? Imaging optics, as you said, if you
Yeah.
learn Gaussian reduction and a few, and maybe, first order
Yeah.
aberrations or Seidel aberrations,
Mm.
you have a cursory understanding of imaging.
Yeah.
Does that situation hold for illumination?
It actually does, but it's more difficult to get to the bottom of it. Huh? And you briefly mentioned this seminar which I gave about étendue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wanted to bring that up. I'll link to that as well.
Yeah, and
in the poster.
étendue is the French word for like size or extent, huh?
Mm-hmm.
And it tells something about the spatial and angular extent of a beam of light. So if some beam of light leaves like a headlamp or something, then it's always an aperture area and an angular range to which light is sent from every point on that aperture area. And étendue captures the idea of the size of that beam. And if you think about the simple magnifying glass, if you put that into the sun, and then you have your burning spot, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Then you have a large area from where the sunlight comes from a small angle, and then you have the small area from where the full lens looks flash, so you have a large angle, so that like the product of area times angle in a sense remains constant.
Right.
And it's that is the core concept you need to understand when you want to come to grips with illumination optics. It's just as fundamental as like a focal length or an image or things like that. But it's not as easy to get to by looking at just a few beams, and this is what makes it so difficult. It's not an obvious concept like an image. It's a more abstract notion, and it brings me to think about light for illumination in terms of Play-Doh.
Mm-hmm.
These little
Mm-hmm.
sticks of red, green, blue Play-Doh, which you can squash around. You can change their shape, but you cannot change the mass and you cannot change the volume without
Right.
cutting anything off. And there's a deep analogy to what light is doing. Or when I talk about scattering, I always think about whipping cream in a bowl.
Uh-huh.
Where the liquid whipping cream would be the dense bright light before it's scattered, and then if you whip it, you mix it with the less dense air, which is the dark light from other directions, and so on. So these analogies actually get us quite far, but it is not obvious, and then there's exceptions to that rule. So you really, many people may have heard about étendue conservation, but not many people really know when it's permitted to apply that and when not.
Mm-hmm.
And it's this difficulty which is not obvious, but it's deep and important. And without having some understanding of that, you will, when you try to design illumination optics, you will be blind and bump against the same concrete walls and get your nose bloody where streams of blood are running down from people before you,
Right.
because you just don't see the right path to the design. And because that's not obvious, it's not being taught at university, and there's little research on that, and there's also not many good books about that. So it's really difficult to learn that. And that's a major thing that is driving me now. You know, after 25 years in the trade, I believe that I have really come to grips with that. So as you mentioned, one of the things I'm doing is I'm doing optical design for illumination as a service, which is something I'm doing a bit differently from the standard engineering business. So what standard engineering service, you go there and then you define a project, and then some guy is doing his work or her work, and then you get a solution, and then you make it happen, and then you have a product. So that's fine. But I try to. So my goal is more to create understanding on the customer side than to just deliver a product. So if I do the optics, I try to make sure that the development team on the customer side really understands what's going on. And I'm not afraid that they're not going to need me anymore, because there's just so much work out there. And if they're happy with me, then they will come back with the more difficult question next time. So that's good. And the other thing I'm doing is I'm teaching. So I'm teaching. I'm giving these seminars, which are free to watch on the OSA website, and some Light Tools user group, and some more are coming right now. I mean, I've been doing this freelance work for just 2 years now, and I'm still in the process of making this more readily available. So I'm teaching these courses face-to-face in Germany, but that's a little distant from California. So now Synopsys is the company that is offering Light Tools in Code 5 and Lucid Shape. They're actually organizing an online version of this course for me, which I'm giving. But they do the organization part of that. So that's the other thing that I'm doing to try to mitigate that, because it is really difficult so I have met many illumination engineers in my professional life, and nearly every single one of them is a side entrant. There are mechanical engineers, electrical engineers, physicists, some mathematicians, some computer scientists, and then all of a sudden they stumble into illumination optics just like I did 25 years ago. And then they try to figure out what happens. And then if they're lucky, they have an older experienced colleague in their team from whom they can learn. And maybe, so today is also easier because there's so much information also in the software, but still it's difficult to learn that. So that's what I'm trying to do. I'm teaching to bring the knowledge across to people which I have gained over the last 25 years.
And that's, so I told you beforehand, I watched your discussion on selection of sources and étendue on the OSA website, and I'll absolutely be sure that we link to that. They were extremely informative. I mean, again, my background isn't per se in illumination, but both of them were very helpful. And I know you said that Synopsys is putting on those lectures. I think the sign-up date, unfortunately, for the first one might be due by today, but I'll link to them so that listeners can see the later lectures. Are you giving those as well at a later date again? Or
yeah.
Okay.
So
for our listeners.
So if it works like intended, it's going to be a series. So we don't have a definite plan yet, but I think it's something that should happen like every 3 months or so.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
So you're not lost. Yeah.
So to kind of to close out the technical side of this discussion, I'm really curious where you see illumination broadly progressing in the future. I know that you've made efforts. You said in an email you've made great efforts towards kind of forming a technical group and establishing it as more of an established back and forth between academia and industry. But what is the future of illumination science?
It is going to be even more pervasive and everywhere than it is right now. And right now you can already say that it's everywhere. Because wherever you look, you see light, and the tendency is clearly towards not just, cranking it up. It's clearly towards engineering whatever is illuminating out there. And with the exception of some things in general lighting, maybe. But I hear from people like John Koschel that the consumer electronics industry, like the tech guys in Silicon Valley, but all over the place, they hire illumination engineers a lot if they can find them. because illumination is going to be a much more integral part of all these gadgets. So when you look at this here,
yeah,
it's so you have this flash on the backside, which actually is a flash made of two chips, like a cold white and a warm white one, so that the camera will automatically match the color temperature to the image. And so that's in there. And then you have either an OLED display, or you have an LCD, an LED lit backlight, and then you have all these variables and all these gadgets are coming. So the entertainment, this is where it's going. And then you have people have crazy ideas, huh? Like so you're aware of these sneakers, of kids sneakers, which have these little LEDs in the soles.
Sure, right.
That
they were
that
the
kind
envy,
of thing.
the envy of all the other kids.
Oh
right?
yeah, of course. Yeah. So they think about integrating LEDs into clothes, huh? Just for the heck of it. Huh?
Right.
And if you look at cars, yeah, you think that LED lighting is already everywhere, but there's more coming, and there's a lot of development going on in the automotive industry to just create a great customer experience for the driver and for the passengers. Huh? And then you have this whole smart home thing, where illuminating your home in an automated way. One topic that has less application than it has promise is what's called human-centric lighting.
I'm not familiar with the phrase.
Okay, so that's actually really fascinating. So most people know that we have like 4 different receptor types in our eyes, so for red, green, blue, and then the rods for night vision. But there's a 5th one, which is distinctly blue sensitive and is distinctly located at the bottom of our eyes. In other words, those cells detect the blue sky if that's present. And those are connected to some deep centers in our brains, which have to do with our circadian rhythm.
Huh.
And they did experiments like they had this school. So remember when we were 14, yeah? And we had to go to school at 8 and we had math.
Right,
so
right.
It is sort of torture, and it's
Yeah.
just not physiologically right to do that with 14 years old. Huh? So they made this experiment. They had 2 classrooms, identical classrooms, and identical classes, basically, just random. Huh? And the only thing they changed is that in one classroom, they had a brightly blue illuminated ceiling in the morning. And then they measured like the EEG currents of the brains. They found out that students actually exhibit, the kids, they exhibit alpha waves. So they're physiologically really sleeping in the classroom. They look like they're awake, but they have alpha waves. They don't.
Right.
They cannot possibly learn anything. And then they also made more experiments like cortisol measurements for measuring objective stress levels, interviews and so on. And it was a clear, distinct, significant, measurable difference that in this blue lit room, the kids were more awake. They had more academic progress. And at the same time, they were subjectively and objectively less stressed. So
instead of having my morning cup of coffee, I should instead just step outside.
Exactly, yeah. Or work at a place where you would have a lot of blue light from above.
Right.
In the morning and in the noon and about noon when that would be natural, and you would dim it down. You know, this is the reason why all these cell phones now have this night shift mode on the yellow light.
Right.
So that's the reason for that. And this interplay between more complex electronic control of lighting and human well-being of animals, that's something that's going to happen. And then horticulture.
Absolutely.
So a real boom for the LED industry in that field was the legalization of marijuana in the United States. Because now you can grow marijuana legally, and in order to do that in like the northern parts of the country, and there's also demand in winter, you do it with horticulture. So you have this eerie magenta light, which is composed of deep blue and deep red, because this is where the green plants absorb. So that really looks creepy because the plants look so black.
Right,
which is the
right.
first place.
Because it's high energy, high absorption efficiency, right?
The idea is to let them out. But now they found out that by proper balancing of the spectral composition of this magenta light, they can control both the growth and the content of the medical ingredients and the content of the THC as well. So, and then you can use it for whatever purpose. So, and that will be coming more, because with the advent of more cheap and efficient LEDs, this is really a very efficient way of growing things in a climate where you just have no light, because in the upper latitudes you just don't have sunlight, and those are just a few examples. And if you look at the cities, one interesting thing is that they did a study over many cultures and many centuries, and found out that people tend to spend about 3% of gross national product for lighting, and that was from the time of candles.
Oh wow!
Until today, and except that now that it's become more pervasive and cheap, we don't save on lighting. We just spend our 3% on making the cities blink.
Right. Yeah. So
pollute.
Right. Exactly. From the telescope and astronomy perspective, pollute.
Yeah.
But it is. I mean, the scope of it and the reach is kind of astonishing. How much illumination does, and it's the part of optics that gets me most excited, because it's the application of light onto things.
Right. Yeah. That's what it is. The other field of physics that fascinates me is quantum physics and cosmology. And I'm not a pro in that field, but I read books. Okay. But nobody in my immediate family environment or my friends, they're all in different professions. There are no physicists. I have no physicist friends, strangely enough, or at least only few of them. But my illumination work, I talk about that, and it's easy. It's immediately possible to convey why that is interesting and fascinating to just about everybody.
Right. Very tangible.
We are vision animals, we human beings. Like dogs are nose animals, we are vision elements, and so that's easy to convey. And so that, but we wanted to talk about the community aspect of that, which is particularly difficult because it is not such an established academic field. So there is no academy part of that. And so I recognized that at Osram, when I joined Osram in 2006, as just go there and do something more practical than just consulting. People kept bugging me. So what does this Eton do? And so I created the course that I'm basically teaching until today. And I thought, okay, instead of answering it individually, I'm gonna teach that course, and I'm gonna teach it maybe once or twice and then be done with it, and then I can go back to my work. In the end, I've been teaching this course for 7 years at Osram, over 30 times to like 500 people. So everybody in Osram, and at the time, I was, again, to be lucky, in the right place at the right time. The chief technology officer of Osram decided that they need to install a credible expert career path in the company, which they didn't have before. So they defined technology fields, and optics was one of them. Then they were looking for people who would know their stuff and would be connected to the outside world in a way that they could represent the field to the outside world, and they would also teach and make the topic work within the company. And since I've been doing this anyway, they chose me as the poster child for that. Which is sort of nice, because you get all this money and company car and the decoration and
the best parts
and the
of
titles and everything.
Yeah, right.
The best part of it was that I didn't have a budget, and I didn't have to manage a team. I was just I was
given free rein, so to speak.
I was the sort of the global coordinator for optics, but I was not the head of a big development team or something like that.
Right.
So I was traveling around the world teaching optics and making sure that everybody was working on the software. And then in the beginning it was just not very conscious, this effort, but later on it was. I used that the title and the influence it gave me to build a community of optics engineers in Osram.
Mm-hmm.
Because when I started, it maybe was like a handful in 2006, because the thinking at Osram was we make the lamps and optics is something that the customer will do with our lamps. But then they found out that they need optical knowledge and optical development by themselves. And this handful has been growing until 2013, when I left Osram, to about 100 people who were really more or less full-time doing optical design in Osram.
Mm-hmm.
And we were able to organize something like an annual Osram internal optics conference, like the SPIE conference in San Diego, but just Osram internal, which everybody considered to be the hottest conference of the year, because there was enough substance, and because it was internal, we could actually talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was where the people met, and so it was a real conference, 3 days full of talks and sessions and titles and session chairs and abstracts and so on. It was a real conference, and people were drinking wine and beer together in the evening and going to the sauna and that kind of thing. And then they would know each other.
Right.
And then we created a discussion forum in 2010, which was also, it was around, but it was not as ubiquitous and pervasive as it is now. It was still some, especially in this old company like Osram, it was, people were, some senior management people were opposed to openly sharing knowledge. They wanted to channel that over their desk.
Right.
Which sounds ridiculous today, and it's still, but it was already ridiculous in 2010. Okay, but we managed to do that.
But it still is a common belief. I just want to interject that, but yeah.
Yeah, but I know that it is, but it just it doesn't work.
Of course.
If you do that, you create a bottleneck, and that's just not helping. Huh? So we were able to do that. And the idea was that people kept bugging me with questions, and with this discussion forum site open, I told them, okay, I will answer that question, but you have to post it there, and I will answer it there. And by the time some guy asked some question about what does A1 optical property quality mean, by the time I got around to answering it, I found that this totally improbable Chris Eichelberger from Michigan had already answered the question, because he was an expert of that. And that's the purpose, I know my stuff, but in a company like Osram, for every single question, there's probably an expert who knows more about that than I do. And then, because they already have been knowing each other from these conferences, they were open to discussing that, and that really worked very well. And it was a great thing, and there was a lot of reorganization going on, and we found by some surveys also that the members of that group, they considered themselves more part of the optical design community within Osram than being part of a random group whose name would change like half a year by some next restructuring.
Right.
And so that was really, really fantastic. And then with that experience, and that's not just something that we did off the top of our heads. So I hired a person who would know a few things about that, and the idea is to, if you want to look that up, Google community of practice. And that is not just a word, this is a standard term in the cognitive sciences. It's a different thing than a community of interest. A community of practice is, I have it here, let me read it out, is a group of people who share a concern or a passion for something they do and learn how to do it better as they interact regularly. I think that's a very good definition of that group. But it's a community of people who do it seriously, professionally, and are not just interested in it, like any other forum, like how do I polish my car. I don't want to put that down, because they're professional polishers, but the people who run around in the forums, they are not. Okay, that's a different thing. we did some really, we had some cognitive science background on that also, which helped a lot to actually get it right, and that was great. And then with that experience in the back of my head, I initiated an illumination optics incubator at OSA.
Mm-hmm.
It was this like the same series of things which there was a Freeform optics incubator earlier on, which now has become the center of Freeform optics. And I wanted to do a similar thing for illumination optics, and to use that incubator thing to jumpstart something like an illumination optics journal and an illumination optics public conference and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a great experience. I found my good friend and colleague Henning Rain, who is also an optical designer, and Groot Gregory, who is product manager for Light Tools, and Man Fock, who is from Hong Kong, who is the head of Diffractive Optics, a great optics manufacturer also for illumination. We were the hosts, and then we had people from all across the world, and 20 people, 25 people across the whole value creation chain from theory, development, research, software, product development, system integration. We had academia, we had a guy from the National Institute of Standards. So we had the whole group together, and I brought up this idea, and then they said, it's not going to work. Now I can laugh about it, but at that time it was really like a hammer in my face. And the reason why it doesn't work is that in order to make that happen, you have to have a critical mass of people who are not only willing, but also allowed to share what they know. And that is the sad state of illumination optics, that this is just not the case. The people who know things all work in industry, and they're not allowed to share what they know. And the brightest and the hottest stuff is being done in Silicon Valley, and for the consumer electronic stuff, it's amazing what these guys do, but the secretive is hell.
Right.
So
it's all IP. And,
it's all IP, and I've been working for a number of those companies, and if I would even mention the name, they would probably sue me.
Right.
Or at least they would have the right to sue me under the NDAs which I had to sign for that.
Sure.
So they will never allow anything that's not like 5 years old to be presented there, and so that's not going to work. And in academia, nothing happens. They would love to talk about it and so on, but this just so it will remain restricted to just some sub
right
like the SPAE conference in San Diego, but so basically all the illumination engineers in the world, and we estimate that there's roughly 20,000 of them over the planet. And we know that number because we had all the people from the software, from the ray tracing software vendors in the room. And then they will never tell you how many seats they have, but when you ask into the room, do you agree with that number? Then they have a pretty good estimate of how many people use their software, and then you get some nods. So and isn't it amazing? You have a profession with 20,000 people, a highly technical profession with deep knowledge required, and no university course.
Yeah, and I mean, it sounds like you have to have some kind of transformative moment in academia that kind of prompts innovation in the university side to really get the ball rolling. I mean, will that happen, or is there something that can, short of promoting the education?
I think there are developments going on in that direction, and I know that in some American universities. So, for example, in Arizona, University of Arizona, you have John Koschel, who is like the lone hero there, and I don't think much is going on at the University of Rochester at this point, but things are. I know that some professors plan illumination optics courses in their universities, and I'm helping them to make it happen with whatever I can do to help them. And and I think it is coming in two ways, which is, and one development is like more universities of applied sciences, sciences. So we cannot change the fact that from the outside, illumination optics looks like, reflector bending and baking and plastic baking and little injection molding. There you go. So it's just what it looks like, and we cannot change that suddenly. But this is stuff that applied sciences is about, huh? And actually, you don't have to study 8 years to understand the theory. Huh? You can do that in a 1-semester course if you like. Huh? And then you go on with more practical things. And so that's something that could fit in the schedule of applied sciences universities or colleges. And the other thing is just professional education. And that's where I'm trying to contribute my part. But I just hope that more is coming. Because this topic is, I'm doing what I can, but this topic is way too big for a little guy like me. I'm just one person, and I can do only what I can. And and I think that ironically, COVID-19 might actually help us, because now you don't have, it's in the head of basically everyone. You don't have to go anywhere to take a course. Huh? So if you can study without being on campus, you can do online courses. And now you can, this whole webinar idea, which you can then reload. Huh? It's not as interactive, and you don't have a guy like me to correct your exercises like in the interactive online course that I'm doing with Synopsys. But this is where it's going to happen, and this will also happen within the companies. So in the big companies, the big electronic companies, they know that they have to catch up somewhere, and they make some, they will have a guy like me who just runs around and enjoys teaching. So they do this company internal. And so those are the development on the education side, which I think is going to happen.
Yeah, that's, I'm particularly getting over the hump of how, I mean, understandably so, it's such powerful technology broadly in optics, and how much it's revolutionized a field of, or various fields, I should say, of technology broadly. But so much of this knowledge is held very, very tightly and very secretively, because it's company property and they don't want to let it go. But overcoming that hump is something that I've witnessed as well on our own forum. So it's an interesting problem. But
so this is the state of affairs, and it's difficult. It's sort of a chicken and egg problem, because if there's not so much out there in terms of this being really an established field, and maybe I should go back to that. Non-imaging optics is considered a branch of optics, pretty much. Huh?
Right.
Isn't it?
Yep. Yeah. Huh? Yeah, absolutely. In my opinion, anyways, I should say.
Yes. Yeah. Also, in the opinion of many optical scientists. Huh? So non-imaging optics is just the branch, huh? And that is the lasting achievement of Roland Winston, and we really have to thank him for that, because he was a particle physics professor in the 1970s at the University of Chicago, and he still was a particle physics professor when I worked there for a year with him. But he came across the problem of detecting Cherenkov radiation in the 1970s, and he wanted to use photomultiplier tubes, and he wanted to make them more efficient, and didn't find readily any theory about how to make that happen. And being a good physicist, he basically developed it, and then later found out that he had reinvented some wheels.
Right.
Which some lone Russians had been published in the 1920s and stuff like that. So there are really some great old papers. But it was Roland who basically, and that was in the 1970s, 80s, that was energy crisis and solar energy coming up. So research for concentrating light for solar energy got money.
Right.
And Roland was sort of the spearhead of the group, and he coined the name non-imaging optics, which I think is not brilliant from a marketing standpoint, because you should never name your product by what it cannot do.
Right.
but he was the spearhead, so it was his right to name it, and he chose that name, and that's just what it is. And there is this science of non-imaging optics, which has largely to do with the path of light and the optical elements that you use for concentrating sunlight. And that's great. And it is a branch of optics, but over the years, I found that illumination optics is not the same. So look at something which is actually quite common. Look at like a follow spot in a theater. A follow spot is like this movable lamp head where you have Beyonce on the stage dancing and singing, and she should be in this nice bright circle with a sharp edge. Okay, so and it's to make that with multicolor LEDs is something that takes some experience to get right. Okay, anyway, but if you look at how that's typically done, you would have the LEDs, and then you would have some optical elements, probably some non-imaging optical elements and some light mixing elements to create a homogeneously illuminated plane, which has this round baffle which you can adjust, and then you would have some imaging zoom projection optics to bring that to the stage. And that is something that we see over again in illumination optics, that good illumination optics engineers, they pluck concepts and optical elements from non-imaging optics like a CPC or a light guide if they need it, or a lens when they want to image some intermediate thing somewhere else. And what's not yet there is that illumination optics, like a separate field in optics which takes concepts from non-imaging optics, from imaging optics, but also from thermodynamics, and puts them together to make good illumination optical systems. That's not yet recognized as a separate field of optics as it should be, at least in my head.
Right.
But it's just what it is.
Yeah. I've already kept you far longer than I told you I would. So, this has been a fantastic conversation, and
well, you get into talking, yeah.
Yeah, well, and I think if anything, I'd love to have you on the podcast again if you'd be up for it. But we can discuss that. Before we go, if you are still willing to do the non-technical overrated, underrated portion.
Oh yeah.
We can keep it pretty short because I don't want to keep you too long. Great. So the gist of it is just I'll throw out a few random ideas. I've solicited some peers who had some questions that they wanted to hear your overrated, underrated, and
okay. And just for the record, I do not know what's coming.
Yeah, correct. That's the key part of this. And as well, of course, always feel free to just say pass if you don't want to cover it. So the first one actually is something that I wanted to ask you about, which is the Bayern Munich football team.
The Bayern Munich football team?
Yeah, the soccer team for the US audience.
That is neither overrated nor underrated. It's, in my opinion, right now, the best soccer football team in the world.
Oh, okay, accurately rated them.
Accurately rated. Yeah.
Okay.
And I mean, it's my hometown. And I visited the first Bayern Munich game probably. That was exactly 51 years ago. I was 8 or 9 years old, and my dad took me to the old stadium where Bayern München beat Hamburg by 5-1, and Beckenbauer shot a goal. So I remember that. So I've been with that club for a long time, and they had their ups and downs. But now they have been winning the German championship for, I think, the 6th time in a row. They won the German Cup. They won the European Champions League Cup, which is otherwise typically won by clubs like Barcelona, Real Madrid, clubs like that, and they they kicked Barcelona.
Yeah.
With Messi.
Right.
They kicked them out in the half final 8-1.
Yeah.
It was. They are really doing a really great job right now, and they may not have the individual top players like Neymar or Messi at this point, but overall they are really hard to beat, and that makes them probably the best team on the planet. Yeah?
I think that's actually part of the strong appeal of that team for me, is that they do not rely on the the star power. That is, they don't have to have a Messi or a Neymar to play so well. So
and they don't and the other interesting thing is they don't have a credit line with the bank. they just have the money.
Yeah, right.
And they don't have an oil prince or a Russian oligarch behind them. It's just
right. Huh, that is pretty interesting. Yeah. So the next question comes from Janet Akery, who traveled in Europe for a bit, and her question was transportation by train, overrated or underrated?
In Europe or over the place?
I think in general.
In general, it's underrated. Traveling by train, if you have a good train system, and I'm lucky to live in a country, in a region where that is actually working quite well. It's just such a convenient and relaxing way to travel. You just hop on the train, you just don't worry about a thing, you don't have to control a car and be afraid of anything, and it gets you there maybe not quite as fast as a car, but that's improving, and it's also much better for the environment.
Right.
So that's something where I have to say you Americans have to catch up.
Yeah. And I don't know that we're making much progress, but
let's not get into that.
Are.
Okay.
Yeah, sure. Of course. Yeah. So a question that comes from Isaac Trumper, he's someone that I work with quite heavily and has an imaging science background.
Yeah.
But his question is image simulation so this is more technical, but image simulation as a quantifier for performance of a system. And I think he means more so with respect to illumination systems. Is that I don't even know if it's done, period, but if it is done, is it overrated or underrated?
I think it's underrated. And I mean, the potential is underrated. And I know a little bit because I worked on the topic a little bit at my time in ARRI. You can think that a good image simulation, to the extent that you really get out of the simulation what the sensor is giving you as a raw image, that's the idea of image simulation, not just on a matte plane. It includes the whole train until you start to do electronic digital processing. So that's something that, to the best of my knowledge, Zeiss is the only company who has a really well-working software to do that, where you could actually physically render a 3D scene as it is seen through a lens.
And Zeiss is the offerer of that.
No, it's company internal.
Pardon me. Okay, pardon me. Yeah.
So they have the software, but they're not going to sell it.
Sure.
I'm not aware of anything else like that, and that would be for the movie industry. Things have become subtle, and you remember Gravity?
Yes.
Movie, okay. Over 98% of the frames, of the individual frames in Gravity, have rendered content.
Wow.
So it was George Clooney and Sandra Bullock
and then everything else
in the astronaut suits,
right,
hanging on ropes in the studio with green screens behind them.
Right.
So that's that. And if you see that happen, then it is imperceptibly wrong in a subtle way. It just doesn't 100% look right, and you cannot put your finger on it. Why? And it's exactly that. The directors of photography, they spend a long time in the rental shops to select the cameras and the lenses to obtain the look that they want to create. And the look is done by shooting the movies with a camera and not in post-production so much. And until today. Right. And then you want to match that look with your rendered content, but you just don't know how to do that because image simulation is missing.
Yeah, it's I'm looking forward to seeing where the industry goes with it in that area. Someone else asked two questions, but I'll just choose one of them, which is projective geometry. Is it overrated or underrated? I think that's an appropriate response to
I think I have to pass on that one because I just don't know enough about that. Huh?
Sure. So I only have two more from myself.
Just one thing comes to mind that if anyone knows the X, Y, and the U prime, V prime color space, then it's projective geometry, which gives you the transformation from one to the other. But that's about the only thing that comes to mind, and that's not enough to say, to really give a judgment whether it's over or under.
Sure. So my final two, Gottfried Leibniz. That one is for me. Overrated or underrated?
Underrated.
How come? Or could you explain more about why?
Because Isaac Newton was just such a jerk.
Yeah.
Don't say anything bad about dead people, okay? But you know, Newton is credited with finding calculus, and it's just not true. It's
right.
And so at least Leibniz should get equal credit, but Newton made sure that he wouldn't.
Yeah. There's
and he had also some other wonderful insights. He had also some very strange ideas, Leibniz, but in general, just because of that, which is like a really, that's the revolution in math, isn't it? Calculus.
Yeah. Absolutely.
It's everywhere, huh? And it's Leibniz who found. I don't say invented because you don't find things, you don't invent things in math. I'm personally convinced that they exist, whether we find them or not, and sometimes we find them.
Yeah. I think as well, you know, some of his ideas, particularly in philosophy as well, are just at the very least very fun to read about. And it's astonishing that this one person had such a wide impact and number of kind of findings that, as you said, he got thrown under the bus by Newton to no small extent. So
I believe that it was him who had the concept of monads.
Yes.
Like people running around as isolated monads in the universe without interaction.
Right.
And I think that goes way too far.
Sure.
And I will never be able to see through your eyes because they're not even connected. They're part of your brain and not mine.
Right.
But so it's fundamentally impossible to experience your experience. Huh?
Yeah.
But we are not monads. We are social animals. Huh?
Right. And there's a great book trilogy, which I'll link again in the postscript to this, called the Baroque Trilogy by Neil Stephenson. But it centers around Newton and Leibniz to no small extent, and kind of in a historical fiction way explores some of their ideas.
Okay, cool. I'm going to read it.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. So, so then the last question for overrated, underrated is currywurst.
Currywurst?
Yes.
Ooh. I think currywurst splits humanity in two parts. You love it or you hate it.
Sure.
And for the ones who love it, it's overrated. It's underrated, and for the ones who hate it, it's overrated, I guess. I personally make sure that I get a currywurst maybe once a month. I know that it's not healthy, but once in a month I just I get this craving, you know.
Yeah. I have to say, from the U.S., from being in the U.S., it's strongly underrated. It's very hard to find them, and it's.
Yes, it's hard to find them.
Yeah, much to my disappointment.
But in every even small German city, you go in every railway station. If there's something, you get a currywurst.
Yeah.
And there are these little mobile vendor shops, which are running around, and what you get there is currywurst. Yeah.
Right.
It's all over the place.
This is only more of a motivation for me to go to Germany now. So.
Yeah, when you do, make sure to let me know. And
sure.
Munich, if you go to Germany, then you will have to go to Munich because You just have to go there because it's really a great city.
Mhm.
And I'm just 10 miles outside, so be my guest.
Sure, absolutely. I'll take you up on that.
Yes,
Um,
please.
well, with that, thank you again so much for your time. And our guest
Thank
again
you.
has been Julius Muschaweck. So thank you very much. And yeah.
Thanks for having me.